All right, welcome back. Boy, is it fantastic to be here. Nino, thank you for organizing the most amazing conference. Having spent time with Rina and others helping to organize conferences, I can say this is really a spectacularly special event. You've found the way to be both cozy and friendly and really strategic and meaningful. So thank you, and thank you for the honor of being here and being able to speak in a place I love more than almost anywhere, and on a topic that is deeply important to me, and in fact is why I and a lot of us up here ever got involved with Georgia in this part of the world. So this session is about the East-West Corridor, which means more than you might believe. I think when people look at a conference program and see there's a discussion on the East-West Corridor, sometimes people duck out. They think this is going to be a narrowly focused discussion about oil and gas pipelines, which it will be partly, which is the beginning point. But the East-West Corridor is way more than that. In the last session with Kurt and just now in Damon and David Kramer, the discussion ended on exploration of whether or not there's consistency between security and democratic values. And I think you'll see at the end of this discussion that those two things are intertwined. You don't have security if you don't have domestic stability. You can't have domestic stability without political and economic freedom. And you can't have stability also without economic prosperity. And the East-West Corridor helps to do all those things. So I think back to President then Saakashvili's first visit to Washington as president. I remember a group of us greeted him, brought him into the presidential guest house, Blair House, and my goal in that meeting was to remind him that the East-West Corridor, Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline, Baku-Supsa oil pipeline, the South Caucasus gas pipeline, the CPC pipeline from Kazakhstan to Russia, this wasn't about the old guard in Georgia. This wasn't about President Shevardnadze, who was a beloved person, by the way, in Washington, as you may recall. But the East-West Corridor was about a way to put steel and tangible assets to work to make all the beautiful slogans about political and economic freedom and shared security into something real. And so after September 11th, September 12th, the first calls that we got were from this part of the world. The first one was from Haidar Aliyev, who said, we are opening Azerbaijan's airspace, our land space, and we got the same call from the Georgians then afterward, to help in any way you need to get your troops to Afghanistan. So the East-West Corridor that began as oil and gas pipelines then became a security corridor that was part of the U.S. reaction to 9/11, which is the one and only time that Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty has ever been invoked. So this East-West Corridor is tied to Article 5. The East-West Corridor is what provides Georgia also an insurance policy that when the European Union, which was a reluctant, late supporter of the East-West Corridor, is looking elsewhere, when, as Damon and Kurt and David were talking about in the last panel, Washington's distracted, you've got this energy corridor that has expanded to involve security, and then we'll talk about values as well, Rina will. That's always there. That's reminding us how central this region is to our vital interests. So I'd like to start with Ed Chow. We're going to go in alphabetical order, if that's okay. I've known Ed for 20 years from his days at Chevron, when we were in the U.S. government trying to convince Chevron to invest in the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline. Chevron was huge in Kazakhstan, wasn't so big yet in Azerbaijan, but now is a key actor in Azerbaijan as well. But Ed is also one of the leading strategic thinkers on energy security in Washington, now at the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS. So Ed, maybe you can help us understand from the energy sector's perspective the significance of the East-West Corridor, how it came about, and how it's doing.
Thank you very much, Matt. My old friend Matt knows that I have very limited competence in oil and gas, and I'm glad that we're going to talk about other aspects of the East-West Corridor as well. I've been coming to Georgia for almost 25 years as starting with Chevron, as part of the development of this corridor. And as I thought about it this morning and reflect on how much the world has changed in those 20-some years. 25 years ago, there was very clear that America was the dominant country in the world at the end of the Cold War. America was the largest oil importer in the world, and looked like it was going to be the largest oil importer in the world forever. So any incremental supply of oil and gas hitting the global market was good for America. And that was very, very clear. At the same time, in the early to mid-90s, the traditional regional powers of Russia and Iran, for example, were on their backs economically. Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia after the financial crisis in '98, Iran was still coming out of the devastation of the Iran-Iraq war. So the traditional regional powers were kind of missing in action, and we had the free space as America to run in what was new territory for us. Turkey was, President Özal's Turkey, President Demirel's Turkey was completely aligned with Western interests, and was a partner in the East-West corridor. We had commercial champions who had a very good business reason to want to promote new pipelines, diversification of supply to the West, particularly BP and from Azerbaijan, but also Chevron, as you mentioned. Everything in those conditions that I've set out has fundamentally changed during the last 20-some years. As a result of the shale revolution, America is now a net gas exporter. The International Energy Agency, in this most recent forecast, sees America a net oil exporter before 2040, which is just unimaginable 20 years ago. Russia and Iran are back in the region in a very major way. Turkey sees its interests as its right, as being independent of Western interests, so looking after itself. China, which was hardly present in this region, is very interested in this region and has a different definition of an East-West corridor than what we thought before. The energy security that the corridor provides is really more about Europe than anything else. So there are certainly signs that Europe recognizes that. Chancellor Merkel's recent visit to the region shows us that. But does Europe institutionally have the capacity to implement policy the way US implemented pipeline diplomacy in the 90s and 2000s, yet to be proven. The commercial champions that are important are now the state oil companies. SOCAR is what's driving TANAP and TAP, no longer the commercial companies. KazMunayGas will have a lot more say about future oil coming out of Kazakhstan. So it seems to me that even for the energy corridor, we need a new narrative. And we need new capacity, particularly from Europe, to focus, to continue to expand the potential that the East-West corridor provides, particularly for European energy security. And America is in a different place than it was before. I mean, I would make the case that America should continue to be engaged in this effort. But would we have cared as much in the 90s? We were already an oil exporter or a gas exporter. It's a counterfactual that's worthy to think about, it seems to me.
Wow. Wow, I would like to just sit back and reflect on those remarks for a couple of hours, but I can't. But that's very powerful insights. I hadn't really thought about those dramatic sets of shifts. I remember in those late 90s days when the companies led by BP and SOCAR and the countries, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey, were negotiating the agreements, the framework agreements for BTC. It was the US and Turkey that were the mediators, the brokers of the agreement, and we worked as one team. It was as if we were almost at the risk of sounding treasonous, from the same country. And that is, well, unthinkable today. And so you brought us to Europe. Let's go to Europe. Let's build on these themes a bit with Rina Kyonka, who's the foreign policy advisor to the president of the European Commission. She's from Estonia. Speaks like a North American because, well, she kind of is. You know, if there's been this deep strategic shift, largely because of the fact that the U.S. is now an oil exporter, and the reality is also that now the East-West corridor has become strategically significant for its second life, or second round, because of natural gas, and Europe is the producer. Well, let's talk about a corridor of values, because if sticking with Chancellor Merkel, she was a strident opponent of the South Stream pipeline, natural gas pipeline from Russia to Turkey, but is a supporter of the Nord Stream pipeline from Russia to Germany. Is this an example of our shared values? I mean, transatlantic community, nothing about Trump in this case, but our shared values colliding with energy and security interests? Rina.
Thank you. Hello, thank you. Thanks, Matt. And I just, is it working? Yes. Just to be specific, I advise the president of the European Council, not the Commission, what is this Nord Stream versus South Stream an expression of a clash of values? I think it's more an expression of a coalition government, to be honest, over several years in Germany, and the different hem and the haw that this implies in terms of any number of policy questions, including energy questions. We can come back to the Nord Stream question if you want later. I'd rather not, but we can. But I wanted to talk about the corridor of values, in fact, because as Kurt Volker said yesterday and several said this morning, Georgia is a country that lives in a very bad neighborhood. It has Russia in the north, it has Iran in the south, and in the east it has Central Asia, and we were just talking with David about we were trading war stories about our times working on Central Asia, and just beyond Central Asia, of course, there's China. And then in the west, there's the European Union. So this is any choice to be made where Georgia and where this region in general falls on that corridor, and the direction of travel is obviously a hugely strategic question. It becomes more so on the values issue if you think about the fact that at least 3 or 4 of those entities that I just mentioned, or the countries or regions that I just mentioned, are actively pushing their values either with soft power or, in the case of Georgia, with very hard power indeed. And I don't exclude the European Union from this, but it makes a bit of a difference because we're on the same page with Georgia on the values question. So I do think it becomes a critical question for Georgia, but Georgia has answered a big part of it, and that is where Georgia lies. Now, we heard the president this morning, we heard a number of political voices this morning, and it's very clear that Georgia has made its choice. This is not a tabula rasa question here. The speaker told us yesterday that 80% of voters here support pro-European parties. Georgia has been on this democratic path for some time. And just to give you an example from one of my previous lives working on human rights, I was for a time High Representative Solana's personal representative for human rights, and in the late part of the 2000s, we were engaged in setting up human rights dialogues with any number of countries. We finally we're close to 50 on those, but this was the time when we were just building up on it. And we were trying to convince various Central Asian countries that this would be a good idea, it would be good for transparency, help the reform effort. And also in the Eastern neighborhood countries, we tried to make forays as well. And I remember very clearly the day in early 2008 when I suddenly got a call from the Georgian ambassador to the EU, and she wanted to see me, and out of the blue. And so she came in and she said, look, we want to have a human rights dialogue with you. And I nearly fell off my chair because it was the first and, to my knowledge, only time that a country itself has actually requested this kind of an exercise as an exercise in transparency and recognizing that this confluence of values is something that is, as Damon said earlier this morning, it's another expression of security. It's an expression of security policy. So all of this democratic path for Georgia has led to all these reforms that has made Georgia the clear front runner in its aspirations for the Euro-Atlantic structures, for joining them. I have picked up over this morning and yesterday certainly something or confirmation of what we understand anyway in Brussels, and that is an increasing frustration in this country over what looks like a kind of stagnation in the movement toward the Euro-Atlantic structures. And I think it's absolutely clear what Mr. Pavilioni said yesterday as well. We shouldn't gloss over the fact that there is some disunity. There is no consensus on enlargement, not in the EU, not in NATO. And that's partly because, as General Hodges noted yesterday, there are too few people in the West who understand really the strategic position of Georgia, for Georgia, but also for the West itself. So where I wanted to go with this discussion was talk about actually how to strengthen the case of the Friends of Georgia and how to deny ammunition to those who are a little bit less friendly. And here I would hearken again and just simply echo something that a number of speakers have already said, and that's the beauty, as David Kramer pointed out to me just before this panel started, that on the second day of a conference, everything's been said, but not by everybody. So this is my chance. What the UK ambassador said yesterday was, and I completely agree, is the way to go forward on this this movement toward continuing to convince member states of the European Union and NATO allies that bringing Georgia in is the right thing, is to continue with the reforms. It's also to continue to be non-selective in applying the rule of law and to present a politically united front. I don't know how many times we've heard this in the last couple of days, but this idea of the rugby scrum really resonated with me. Pulling together like Georgia and Georgian politicians did in the run-up to achieving visa liberalization, which was a huge step, a huge achievement, and we're all, on both sides of that, are reaping the benefits. So I would end with just two closing remarks, or two closing observations. One is that democratic development is not unidirectional and it's not irreversible. We see this all over the place. We see this all over the EU right now. If you've been following the news back in Brussels, then you're well aware that there are discussions in the European Parliament over enacting Article 7 for one of our member states right now. There is a huge and growing concern, given the European Parliament elections coming up next year, in a situation where, as we know now after Sweden's elections over the weekend, in a situation in which 10 of 28 member states of the EU have substantial far-right parties occupying political space right now. And in a situation in which the conventional wisdom, what we've always known, which is that elections are won in the center, this is becoming less and less obvious, and what is becoming increasingly obvious is that elections are lost at the edges. And this is something we need to pay attention to. It's certainly true, this fact of irreversibility and unidirectionality. It's certainly true also of the United States. I hearken back to the panel just before this, and we're going to talk about it in the later part of today. But it's not my point, it's not my place to say anything about that, despite my North American heritage. But I would just here hearken or evoke the memory of Senator McCain, who said, you know, we have to be better than that. My second and final and very brief observation is another thing that Senator McCain reminded us early and often, and that is that democracy is a battle that needs to be fought every day. Georgia has made its choice. There's no turning back on the choice itself, but it's a choice that has to be defended every day. It's a political choice that we all make, all leaders make, all citizens make every morning when we wake up. So I'd like to end on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rena. Beautiful points. I'd like to expand on this last point about irreversibility or stagnation of reform and connect it back to energy for a moment. When I first got interested in Georgia, it was back in 1998, and at that time the Clinton administration was focused very much on helping Georgia advance its political and economic reforms, and especially on energy, because energy was the great weak point of the entire state, right? The Georgian state, because it was so corrupt, because the national budget was so small, nobody was paying their energy bills, right? No one was paying their electricity bills. You may recall there was a moment when AES, the American company, came in, put meters on all the housing blocks here. Some of the inspectors were actually, there was a case, at least one murder, because people didn't want to have to pay their bills. The society was rotting, and the state was practically ceasing to exist. And the lack of reform of the energy sector was a big part of that problem. And subsequently, one of the first places where the reforms began was in the energy sector. And I guess I'm just reinforcing your point that were that progress on reform to be reversed, there are all sorts of vulnerabilities throughout this society that you might not think of. But then shifting back to the regional and geostrategic, because in the end, the East-West corridor is also a way, as we said in the beginning, to cement Georgia's place, at least in terms of an infrastructure connection in this community of shared values. But that this community hopefully extends in the other direction too, eventually, eastward, hopefully across the Caspian. David, with Summit Investments, but someone I've known for also 20 years from your days in the Senate as one of the leading strategic minds there, Foreign Relations Committee, but also together on the in the State Department when you were the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Russia, Belarus, Ukraine. And then I had the honor of you replacing me at the National Security Council and working on Central Asia. You are one of the great experienced old hands in Washington on Central Asia. So could you tell us a bit about the fate of the East-West corridor looking eastward now?
Thank you very much. Is this, yes? First of all, thank you very much, Matt. And I had the opportunity one time of introducing Matt, and I talked about U.S. diplomats not being able to walk through an open door where Matt could push through any kind of a door in pursuit of a policy goal. I started visiting Georgia in '94 when I headed up the Moscow office for the International Republican Institute, and have come here in different jobs, including bringing my family here a few years ago. But this is my first time at this conference, and I'm very grateful to Kurt for the invitation. It's great to be here. This past Friday, because of a long relationship that my wife has with the McCains, Cindy, John's widow, and a couple of the kids were over at the house this past Friday. And we were having dinner, and as we were making plans for Saturday evening, I told her that I'd be coming this direction. And I wanted to relay what she said, which was how pleased she was that the first big event of the McCain Institute after the ceremony was here in Georgia, and how pleased that made her, and how pleased she knew that would make John. And there's been such nice things said about Senator McCain, but what she said is that how much he shared with all of you, with all of us, in a commitment to democratic values and a commitment to preserving territorial integrity and sovereignty, and a commitment to standing up. So it was more really her words towards you, and tipping of her hat to everybody here. The achievement of the energy pipelines, of making a concrete structure that connected this region to Europe, was something that couldn't be reversed. And we've talked a lot about this region being a bad neighborhood or something, and it is clear that this region is one of conflict and not of cooperation, and that makes investment difficult. Tamara yesterday was kind of curious about why there's not more foreign direct investment from the United States. The president today talked about why there wasn't more appreciation for Georgia. And in fact, Georgia's own numbers for foreign direct investment have at the top of the list at about $500 million Azerbaijan. You have to go all the way down to 80 million for the United States. And you have the European countries of the Netherlands, the UK, Luxembourg, and the Czech Republic before you get to China at 40. So I think that what's so important about this East-West corridor is it provides an opportunity, as in the rail, in the Baku-Tbilisi-Kars rail, to do what the oil and gas pipeline have done. But as Matt said, it's insufficient just to think about the Caucasus. Let's go ahead and go beyond that and think about Central Asia and China. There's been a lot talked about the Belt Road Initiative, and in fact, there's been a huge investment in Korbos on the Kazakh-Chinese border for the largest dry port facility where the Chinese Costco owns 49% of it. Thus far, what's being brought in on rails is not really, in large measure, reaching Europe, and the trade that's going from China to Europe, only 1% of it is going by land. Yet there's a great possibility that the time saved for the products brought by land will be meaningful for electronics going from China, and perhaps refrigerated commodities such as food or wine going from Europe. So it's a real possibility for Georgia to add a value to Europe, and one that is independent of Russia. Now, I think you all would notice that the ports in Latvia are getting less and less volume because Russia has decided that Russia products through Russia ports, because of the existing rail and because of the new rail. This can go all the way from China to Georgia without depending on Russia. But we've also seen the Belt Road Initiative as a fearful sign as far as what is it? Is it China trying to trade debt for assets? And there's been really negative examples in South Asia where China has got a 99-year lease on the port because the country was unable to pay their debt. So it's not something that should be just accepted without some reservations. And I think that's why it's so important for Georgia to try and look at a role for itself to fill those rail cars heading back east. That's something that they've already got the existing infrastructure with the Baku Tbilisi-Kars rail, although it's not being utilized, and it's a possibility of it moving over. This will give this region that's been in such conflict. George Shultz used to say that when you can't solve a problem, try and make it bigger. So this is an opportunity to try and not just focus in on the Caucasus, but really appreciate the geography that Georgia has. Georgia is well aware of the negative side of the geography, but there's also a lot of growth possibilities. And I think that there's been so much talked about with regard to the elections and the very right focus on the values, but obviously citizens also want prosperity, and that requires a lot more commercial activity than Georgia currently enjoys, and there may be an opportunity with kind of the next phase of this east-west corridor.
David, thank you. Yeah, I have never really thought about that factor of the emerging sort of threat to Georgia's full sovereignty from the Belt and Road Initiative, and the need for Georgia to step into that space and use it and fill it as much as it possibly can to make sure these changes are irreversible. And yeah, it just reminds me of, well, that Georgia, as you said, is really in the center, as many people have said, of many conflicting zones of conflict. And let's go back maybe for a moment to Russia and to harder security, because our next speaker is Dato Sikhorilidze, who is not only the former ambassador to the United States, but also former Minister of Defense. And I've just been thinking a bit lately about an image of, during the Russian invasion of Georgia, of how the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline was not touched, right? And there were bomb craters, and Batu and I were talking about this about 10 days ago, Kutelia. Bomb craters right next to it, but it was never hit. Certainly the Russian pilots knew where that pipeline was. Certainly they're skillful enough to hit it if they wanted to. They chose not to. So it's as if this business connectivity that David was just talking about, that Georgia had through BP, through Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan, through the governments with which Georgia allied, provided some sort of physical security. So, Dato, please reflect on that if you wish, but also tell us a bit more about the additional opportunities that Georgia provides for us in the transatlantic community to secure our own security, pardon the redundancy.
Thank you, Matt. Well, first thing what comes in Georgians' mind when we're speaking about the East-West corridor is the opportunity. So, very big contribution into Georgia's transformation and development. The greatest contribution was made by those opportunities that have been created with the East-West corridor, and I completely agree it's far beyond only the transportation of the hydrocarbons, but also the entire concept of connecting the Georgia playing the hub, role of hub, or the connecting role from west to east, and then farther to cross Caspian. So I think that speaking of opportunities, we have certain new developments here. Then now one development that is new, that has the convention, Caspian Sea Convention, that has been signed this summer. This been a long-standing dispute over the status of Caspian Sea, whether how to divide it as a lake or as a sea, and this dispute had, of course, practical implications. It was not just simply the academic debate, and that debate has prevented, partially, of course, not entirely, but partially also prevented Central Asian to connect to connect Central Asian energy resources with Azerbaijan and further to west. Still many questions remained around this convention, and there are still many things must be clarified. But however, I think that this represents clearly opportunity for the Trans-Caspian pipeline, because legally Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan can create, go ahead, legally can go ahead and build this pipeline, which is the great opportunity. Speaking of opportunities, of course, the role that has been played by, it's difficult to overestimate the role that has been played by PTC and the gas pipeline that takes Western Caspian oil and gas resources farther to west. For Georgia, it provided practically very serious energy independence from Russia. And Russia, in the hybrid war, one of the weapons for Russia was this energy and then gas. Also, there are many opportunities that are not that clearly visible, but for example, the opportunities that have been properly used, not fully, but most of them properly used by Georgia, helped Georgia to not only to survive Russian economic embargo, but in 2010, well, the first year of Russian economic embargo was 2007, and that was also a year when we had the record economic growth in 21st century. But also to compare 2010 and economic growth of 2010-2013, when we were under embargo, operating under Russian embargo, and that our dependency before embargo on the Russian market was high, the 7% average economic growth from 2010 to 2013, when embargo was lifted, even twice bigger than after embargo was lifted, from 2013 to up to date. So mostly Georgian economy was operating effectively because of the opportunities from the east-west corridor. I can even recall, I just don't want to go deep in details, but this fact is very interesting that in 1 year, the #1 export of Georgia were cars, even though we are not producing any cars. But the second-hand cars that we were bringing here and selling farther down to other countries, the easy regulations for transportation, and also these opportunities helped Georgia to survive, to develop economically. So I think that Caspian Sea Convention also represents yet another opportunity, but it's not given. So I think that now I have to start talking about the importance of the U.S. engagement and U.S. presence and then U.S. involvement in this developing of East-West corridor. We have also good development on Anaklia port. The Anaklia port is a very important part of this concept of the East-West corridor. And Anaklia Deepwater Port, we've been long time struggling with this, building this. But I think that it can be only successful if the with the U.S. serious engagement in this port. And then the last news is very positive, that Overseas Private Investment Corporation agreed to finance it. I think that also we need more private initiatives, not only on Anaklia port, particularly on others, so that will make Georgia more competitive. And also having in mind this Belt and Road Initiative, we have to stay competitive on this, and also be the good partner. And I think that it is not only in Georgia's interest, but in U.S. interest to have a presence on this part. And my last point, which maybe not very directly related to, well, only economy, but still it is important. It's what in NATO jargon called the host nation capabilities. Those who are familiar with this know what does it mean, but well, in fact, on a human language, it means that developing the infrastructure, such as ports, railways, well, the storages, and other kind of infrastructure that could, in case of need, used by military, but in time when it's not needed by military, can be used by civilian and business infrastructure. So I think that this is yet another opportunity for us to cooperate with the U.S. and then to start looking into the developing Georgia's host nation capabilities that would contribute into hard security first, then that would be yet additional argument for expanding NATO and for convincing those skeptics that are just talking about the NATO expansion and the defendability issues. NATO, I think that, and it also would be really very good for the Georgia's economy. So I think those points, opportunities, and possible, and the railway, of course, and the railway. Well, there were no talks on this yet, but I think that it would be also important to seek EU and the ways that EU and US companies can invest in Georgian Railway. So Georgian Railway is it's a strategic infrastructure, Georgia's strategic infrastructure, even though it's not doing lately very well. The turnout decreased. But I think that with the proper partners and the management, that could be really there are much bigger opportunities in this. And plus, that was mentioned, David, you mentioned the Karsa-Halkalaki railway that has not gone operational yet. I think that it's yet another place where Georgia should be looking at and then supporting and then promoting this Karsa-Halkalaki to go operational.
All right. Thank you, Dato. So expand, and now it's time for questions, by the way. So think of some. We have about 15 minutes. With your permission, I'll start it off. But I want to reflect for a moment on what you said too, Dato. Yeah, Georgia, at least, when Kurt and I were together on the National Security Council staff, was a country that made its own opportunities. Yeah, we opened the doors, but it made its opportunities. When Russia was creating problems and Chechen fighters were creating big problems in Pankizi Gorge, we worked together to develop the Georgia Train and Equip program, which we were thinking is a way to pull Georgia toward the transatlantic community while fixing this serious problem that was providing Russia an excuse maybe to intervene militarily in Georgia. It worked. Then Georgia became the largest per capita troop contributor to U.S. military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that created a lot of goodwill in the United States, but a lot of capability, and helped people begin to understand that Georgia deserves to be in NATO. Now that debate's stalled for reasons we all know, but this host government, host country capability idea is another creative one that I hope will happen, and we'll see also then this government creating investment opportunities so the things that David was talking about in terms of using the transportation corridor more effectively happen. So my question though then is about another opportunity that you raised just now, David, Trans-Caspian gas. And this is to anybody. A, how viable do we think it is? B, is there a reason why this Georgian government isn't out there strongly supporting it? Because this project is a way, again, to change the geostrategic map in a positive way and to ensure that Georgia plays an increasingly important role for the European Union as well, both the Council and the Commission. David. Yeah. Yeah.
I think I'm going to be a naysayer here. I don't think that there's much there in the Caspian agreement, and I don't think that there is much of a near-term possibility about Turkmen gas crossing to Azerbaijan, and obviously the oil from Kazakhstan is going just fine by rail. One of the things that one of the things that is of note about the agreement is that it was agreed that there can be no non-literal military in the Caspian, and that the Russians are moving their fleet over to a facility closer to Kazakhstan. So I think it's more of a box checks than a real escalator or accelerator towards greater exploration of the Caspian or transport across the Caspian, in my view.
I'm not an energy expert by any means, but I did cover Central Asia for a while, and from what I understand, recall from then and my knowledge of the agreement over the Caspian Sea is that the major problem through the years not in Caspian gas in general, but for the TCP, the pipeline, was not so much getting agreement amongst the parties, but it was to get the Turkmens to agree to go ahead, and it was really more a question of business culture because they wanted guarantees from states, and what they needed to do was actually talk to the companies who were going to invest. So that I don't see it as a legal, but as a sort of a cultural question.
Just to build on what my colleagues have already said, and reflect also on what I talked about earlier, the problem, I agree with David that the recent Caspian agreement signed, I guess in Atyrau, was more theater than substance, at least on the point of oil and gas. So, because there is no agreement on demarcation in terms of rights to exploit oil and gas assets in the Caspian. There is, in principle, allowing pipelines to cross the Caspian, which is good. I mean, it's better that they agree than they hadn't mentioned it at all. The economics are questionable on Trans-Caspian. And the Turkmen problem is really the question of would they ever allow upstream stake to oil companies to invest in the upstream in Turkmenistan in the gas fields. Oil companies don't invest in pipelines. Pipelines are cost centers, they're not profit centers. So no one's going to invest in a pipeline unless they have an upstream stake that they want to monetize. So that's a structural problem that needs to be overcome. It may be possible to overcome that over time, but here's where European leadership is necessary, and perhaps working with America. But unlike the 90s and the 2000s, you can't assume that America will take the leadership role because we're in a very different energy posture than we once was. So a lot more European effort would be necessary to talk to Turkmenistan and other countries to make it possible, assuming the economics were there. The alternative is that Kashagan oil will go to China. The alternative is Galkanish gas will go to China. So make it very clear that this is about European energy security most of all, and therefore it is up to Europe to put effort in it. Matt, if you would permit me to add one more thing, reflecting on what David said about the East-West corridor. The problem with rail is backhaul. The problem with rail is that containers go from China to Europe full of goods, and they come back empty. And that's why maritime shipment continues to be the preferred way of going. So what Georgia has is the opportunity to have value added on things going back the other way. And that is an opportunity of an East-West corridor for Georgia. It's not just as a pass-through country, but a country that generates goods, services included, that would go the other direction. And this was historically true of the Silk Road. The Central Asia was not just a pass-through. They also, if you look at Chinese traditional furniture, there are characteristics that come from Central Asia. If you look at what is considered traditional Chinese music, the instruments are Central Asian instruments. They're not indigenous to China. So the old Silk Road worked because it wasn't just Chinese silk going to Europe and coming back, the caravans coming back empty. It had to have value added to make that viable in an economic sense. And here Georgia has an opportunity. If the railroads are not used, because they need to be used in both directions, not one direction.
It's one of the most interesting things I've heard all this month. Thank you for that, Ed. Yeah. Dato, did you want to have a rebuttal for any of this? Or we were
I just entirely agree with Ed, yeah, I agree that it's not really solved, this issue of Trans-Caspian pipeline, and then there are many issues from economics to security and to inter-country relations. I just said that it's a step forward that has not been on the place before.
Excellent. Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. Yes, sir, way in the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Nika Chitadze. I'm professor of the International Black Sea University. With your permission, I have a question related to, we discussed about East-West corridor, but I have the question related to the let's say, transatlantic links in the field of energy, taking into consideration the perspectives of the export of shale gas from the United States America to Europe, taking into consideration that during the last 4 or 5 years, the volume of the producing the natural gas in US prevails the volume of the producing natural gas on the territory of Russian Federation. Europe each year, as I know, consumes about 600 billion cubic meters of natural gas, and but it's still, despite of sanctions against Russia, it still is dependent on Russia, and if I'm not mistaken, from 150 on average billion cubic meters of natural gas each year is exported on the European market, and it's being considered the other pipeline projects, including Northern pipeline, capacity of which is 55 billion cubic meters. So perspectives of the export of natural gas from US, also taking into consideration that in comparison with Russia, US has no its own Gazprom or Rosneft, etc. What about the position of commercial companies in this regard? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. David. David and Ed.
Well, let me dampen your enthusiasm for US LNG to Europe. It doesn't mean that Europe won't benefit indirectly from US LNG exports, but there are a couple of different reasons why they won't happen at scale. One is that, now, how would Europe benefit? US LNG would add more liquidity into the global LNG market. There will be more trading of LNG globally. Our gas price is not fixed to oil prices at all, so they'll bring more gas on gas competition throughout the world. That's all good. The problem is that we're far away, and liquefaction, shipment, and regasification costs are very, very high. So it's just, we are not a substitute for Russian gas, but it would put a cap on how much Russia can charge Europe for gas. And therefore, Europe does benefits. You're right, we don't have Gazprom, which we think is a very good thing. So the exports are going to be done based on commercial decisions. And we have a natural advantage to export our LNG to South America, where it's a big market. And the prices in the Far East is a lot higher. So the US LNG, there will be spot cargo that comes to Europe from time to time, but it would primarily go to South America and Japan, China, and Korea.
Okay, David says, Ed thoroughly answered that question, so, and it's true. Ian Bond.
Thank you very much. Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform. I wanted to come back to the link between the East-West Corridor and the Belt and Road Initiative. 2 or 3 years ago, the EU was looking at a so-called connectivity platform with the Chinese, looking at how the EU's own initiatives on East-West corridors could link up to the Belt and Road Initiative. More recently, I've detected a bit more worry about what the consequences are of letting the Chinese get a strong foothold in Eastern Europe. And I know you can't speak for the Commission, but I know the Commission has not been terribly happy about the 16+1 process between China and the Eastern European countries, seeing it as a way of driving some wedges into EU unity over issues like Chinese human rights. So where do we stand now? You know, do we see Chinese involvement in this region as a potentially useful counterweight to Russian involvement? Do we see it in terms of opening up Central Asia for Europe as well as for China? Or do we see this as a Chinese geopolitical play which actually creates some risks for us? And for the American side of this panel, at a time when globally the US sees China as a very potentially threatening country, posing some big challenges to the US, is it a good or a bad thing to have China increasingly involved in the affairs of your allies in Europe?
A great question that almost answers itself, but doesn't. And we've got just a couple of minutes. There's Kurt, so maybe to Rina, yeah?
Yes, very good question. 3 remarks. First of all, I think that having China serve as a counterweight to Russia in this area of the world is not a good choice to be made. It's like being between the devil and the deep blue sea. So we would like to, you know, avoid a kind of stark dichotomy this way. The second thing is that the Chinese, how Europe is looking at the Belt and Road initiative is as almost as a phenomenon of nature right now that cannot be changed. China is putting so many resources, so much political clout behind that. It's really the guiding understanding of foreign affairs at this point. And we see differing aspects of that every year when we have a summit with the Chinese, and this for the last 3-4 years. So Europe's answer to that is our own connectivity project, which is in the works and seeking to kind of make lemonade out of lemons, if you will. The third point is on the 16+1. It's not only just the Commission that is a little nervous or a little unhappy about the 16+1. 16+1 is the grouping of 16 member states and non-member states, roughly speaking, in this part of the world, who have a yearly summit with the Chinese. And it's sometimes presented on the Chinese side as not really as a competition for the bilateral EU-China relationship, but it kind of looks that way. So it's certainly a number of member states as well who have expressed consternation within the European Council over little groupings like this, like the 16+1. For the smaller member states who do belong to it, it's completely explicable. It's, the smaller member states and the ones who are not in the European Union are trying to get a piece of the pie. They're trying to get a little bit of attention from the Chinese. And if you're not Germany or you're not France, then it's awfully difficult to do that. And so this was the real, the tactical reason for going ahead with this. It happens that my boss, President Tusk, hosted the first 16+1 in Warsaw when he was the prime minister. Now it's kind of difficult for him because he has to take the opposite point of view, which is always kind of comical to try to explain to our Chinese partners. But so there are opinions on both sides of the 16+1 question, but I think it's what we're seeing, what we saw in this year's edition anyway. It seems to be losing steam a little bit.
Okay, and with one foot ready to get off the stage, the last word to David Merkel.
I want to take a contrary view. Certainly being cautious and strategic and eyes wide open. But from a U.S. perspective, I think a couple things to remember. One, we can't counter China in every direction. And I think that we have a need to counter China more in East Asia, in the South China Sea, than through Central Asia. I also think that integrating Central Asia between China and Europe has some real upside. The second thing I think we have learned is we tried to frustrate China with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They were committed to it. It exists. It's not a fantastic thing, but it exists. The U.S. tried to counter China on the development bank. We couldn't even convince the Brits not to join it, and we weren't able to shape it at all. So I think that we should try and engage through the multilateral development banks, advise the host nation states, work with the EU, and be a bit smarter about what China's directions are and how we can advise countries that are going to be receiving these infrastructure projects.
Great. Panelists, thank you for your succinct, insightful, clear comments and for your decades of friendship. Thank you very much.